March 2003, the Bush administration invaded Iraq in the hope of discovering weapons of mass destruction as well as uncovering Saddam Hussein's supposedly threatening regime. This was particularly in response to the atrocities of 9/11, as the US suspected that Iraq had some involvement in 9/11. Others speculated that Iraq's oil distribution and possession could also explain the invasion. However, this was not effectively supported. The invasion of Iraq generated a significant amount of controversy, not only for Iraq and the US, but for global foreign policy. The primary issue of the Iraq invasion was its illegality, and the secondary issue was the lack of response from the UN and other international law enforcement bodies. Although the US did not acquire enough evidence to legitimize their attack, they continued with their attack and defied international laws while doing so. One of the responses that could have been implemented is the responsibility to protect principle. This principle was implemented after the international community was unsure of how to address situations where a nation was not only conducting these atrocities on their own people, but was standing back when others were conducting the same atrocities. The R2P essentially protects nations from war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. This protection can be facilitated through measures that are essential, whether they are diplomatic, peaceful, or humanitarian. Since the state generally acquires the adequate resources that can prevent war crimes, they ultimately possess the fundamental responsibility in protecting their own nation. However, a significant issue is that governments are generally reluctant in exercising these powers due to their own domestic reasons. Another prevention tool that would have been practical is the International Criminal Court. Bearing in mind former failures regarding an international consensus on a global tribunal, the ICC is a remarkable achievement, or at least is considered a remarkable achievement. The ICC was created in 1998 and commenced in 2002 with the aim of deterring war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, as well as advocating for human rights by clearly condemning any individual, irrespective of whether they are an employee of the state or not, from violating these human rights. International tribunals such as the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda differ to the ICC in that they were formed through the United Nations Security Council, whereas the ICC was formed through the Rome Statute. Essentially, the difference between these two is that the former is binding and the latter is a voluntary decision, meaning that only those who voluntarily sign it are bound by it. The three large states that chose this option are the United States, China, and India, on the grounds that the statute was inconsistent. This evidently generated further controversy. Some would say that the US plainly violated international laws and regulations. While this did generate significant controversy in the international community, the fact that there was no response from the UN further provoked the issue. Although there is a challenge in implementing or even establishing an ideal international justice mechanism, two responses that could have been implemented are the R2P and the ICC. Although the US claimed that Iraq was an imminent threat to their sovereignty and national security, they did not carry out their attacks in accordance with international laws and regulations. The R2P principle could have therefore been implemented to reduce the harm in Iraq. While the intervention of another state would be considered beneficial, there are also a few criticisms that would make them reluctant to help. One of these is the fear that they will lose their sovereignty, as the United Nations ultimately bears their own responsibility to intervene when atrocities take place. An example of this is the Libya case, where Muammar Gaddafi's regime appeared to be oppressing his own people. To justify this invasion, there must have been approval from the United Nations Security Council in accordance with Article 51, where the use of force is acceptable so long as it is used for defense. The US, France, and the UK partook in this intervention in the hope that it would save the population from the oppression of Gaddafi. This case could have been used as a guide to dealing with Iraq as humanely as possible rather than seeking to merely overthrow Saddam and his government. On the other hand, though, R2P in the form of humanitarian intervention hasn't always been the most exercised notion, as previously experienced during the Rwanda genocide, where a genocide convention existed within the United Nations, however, atrocities still continued. This not only undermines the role and the reliance of the United Nations, but shifts political attitudes surrounding whether a principle like R2P would affect the Iraq invasion. By undermining this role, nations are also more reluctant to abide by it. A further criticism includes the challenge of achieving universal consensus. Due to conflicting views on politics or culture, it may be difficult for all nations to agree on one single principle. While the notion of R2P seems practical, there are certain barriers that prevent it from fulfilling all global issues. As previously mentioned, the ICC was established as a means to addressing international crime such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Despite the independence and significance of the ICC, however, it is also limited in its jurisdiction and what it is able to address. One of the first limitations is that the US possesses veto power and is therefore able to alter or reject decisions made by the Security Council. This ultimately undermines their importance as they are unable to actually bind nations such as the US. Accordingly, the US is not a party to the ICC and is therefore not bound by its decisions. The ICC can serve justice as demonstrated by the case of Ahmed al-Mahdi, who had an alliance with al-Qaeda. He was sentenced to 9 years on the grounds of directing attacks on historic monuments. While this did serve justice, there are still an insufficient number of cases that either didn't end justly or didn't even make it to the ICC. Therefore, the idea of an ICC would have been beneficial in that it would hold the US accountable for their actions. However, due to the US's reluctance in becoming a party of it, it challenges the effectiveness of the ICC. There are several reforms that can be put into place to address international crimes such as the Iraq invasion. However, due to conflicting beliefs regarding culture, politics, and values, it creates a significant barrier for the international community to be able to achieve a mutual consensus. The improvement of the R2P and the ICC would have been beneficial to address Iraq's issue, as well as preventing or addressing similar issues in the future. For example, making the ICC mandatory could ensure that all atrocities are addressed and the perpetrators are held accountable. And by making R2P a mutually binding principle, it ensures that in times of crisis, the deprived nations are not only overlooked, but that they are addressed. Before starting this unit, I definitely now know that there was a lot that there was a significant gap in my knowledge in terms of international crime and the broad scope that it has, as well as the difficulties in actually addressing international crime. I used to think that if someone was to violate human rights, then they automatically just get sent to the United Nations where they get sentenced. But seeing with the case of Iraq, it's not really that simple. I mean, sometimes even if you do breach international laws, there are several processes that could be problematic, and it turns out that it might not even be solved. So I think my views on international crime definitely changed after taking this unit and just doing further research. I mean, I didn't even know what the concepts of globalization or sovereignty even were, or how important they were. Seeing how much countries sacrifice in order to keep their sovereignty, like the case of Iraq or the case of Libya. I think this is one of the aspects of criminal justice where it needs further research, because there's definitely flaws to it, and by addressing all these issues, we could come up with a with better outcomes altogether.